Alright, let's jump into this game analysis. Here I'm going to be presenting a game I played at the US Amateur Team North over the last weekend. I was playing in this round against a much lower rated opponent. I had the white pieces, so I was gunning for a complicated game where I just, squeeze the guy or something and win. Started with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and knight f6. So now we've officially settled into the Queen's Gambit declined. And I've got to say that probably the most challenging variation in this version of the Queen's Gambit declined is the exchange variation, where coming off of this tabia position, I'm just going to briefly highlight the main setups that both white and black are aiming for, and why I think white is both better and has the easier game. So as white, I'm looking to play e3, bishop d3, queen c2, and key move knight to e2, not to f3, which you might think is the most natural square. Why to e2? Because I want to later push f4, e4, get rid of some of those arrows, have a nice central pawn majority, which I could then threaten to push even further and have a great advantage. So what is black trying to do? The most typical setup that black can adopt is quite simple. This is why you'll see a lot of people play it, because they can memorize the first 8 to 10 moves and get a solid position and not have to worry about a lot of theory against the d4 openings. They're going to put their bishop to e7, pawn to c6, knight to d7, castle. After they've castled, the rook will come to f8, the knight will come reroute to g6, the bishop will sit on e6. There's just a lot of easy typical plans that black can adopt there that get them through the opening stage. However, I think that in this battle where central majority versus just some solid setup, I think anyone would agree that having the central majority, that you're the one pressing for advantage, you're the one making it complicated and threatening to take the game into your hands. Definitely want to play the white side of that. So already this position's a little important. Imagining the black setup I just talked about, you can see that both, not both, all three of these moves have transpositional possibility into that desired setup. However, I would say that both knight b to d7 and c6 have their own independent value. Bishop e7, blandest of the moves, doesn't really do much besides break the pin and doesn't have any real nuance behind it. I want to start with knight b to d7. This one's quite interesting because to the uninitiated, why isn't this just a pawn? Well, it's not a pawn because of a very key element of the position, that our king is going to be a little exposed here. When we take their queen, unfortunately, we have to give up our own queen to protect against the pin. So we gotta force ourselves into a skewer. Count the pieces: 2 for white, 3 for black. It turns out that when we take this pawn, we're just giving up the pawn, or giving up the knight for the pawn. So definitely can't go into that. If you see this move knight b to d7, all you need to know is that just play e3, and now they have to actually protect this pawn, probably with c6. Now that our king has a escape square. So I want to talk about why c6 has independent value. Let's just give you an example variation where bishop e7, let's say e3. Why can't black develop this bishop? Well, I already highlighted it here prior to the game, but basically the idea is that black would love to get this bishop out, because if the bishop is developed normally, then it usually means that black has already equalized and has good chances, because this is the problem piece. Notice that it's on the same color squares, especially if we have c6 inserted, as the central pawn majority here, and typically it has really hard time finding a good square, which is why it will end up on e6 most of the time. And if black can just solve this problem while stopping us from having a good active square for our bishop, it just means that black has already equalized. Nothing much to say there. However, the problem with developing it too early is that, as I highlighted at the beginning here, this pawn is left undefended, and this pawn is still weak. So, simple trade leaves us with a double attack, and really there's no compensation here. We're going to pick up a free pawn, depending on which one of these two black protects. So, definitely can't play that. Now you see the idea behind c6. The idea behind c6, we're defending d5. Now bishop f5 is definitely possible. because they only have one pawn to worry about. Queen b3. You can even play b6. It's worth having these weakened pawns just to get the bishop developed, which is why the main move here is queen c2, just covering the square. Should be noted really briefly that e3 is possible, where you have this move queen f3, and you can mess up the black pawn structure. Here I've highlighted that black has the bishops as compensation. Yes, this pawn structure is really terrible, but it's deceptive. White's advantage is deceptive. I mean, it's very hard. It's going to be a long game. A relevant game recently, back in 2016, Magnus Carlsen even played this with white and really ground out Vladimir Kramnik, also a world-class player. Both have been world champion. So it does go to show that white has a long-lasting edge here against the static structure. In that game, Magnus outposted the knight on f5, but it's really positionally complicated and not what I was looking for at all. I think it's really easy to avoid this excursion. Just play queen c2, stop the bishop coming to f5, and I'm going to get my desired setup. And you can see that most of the moves just follow naturally. Notice black is going for their setup that I talked about. White is going for the setup that I wanted, bishop e6, and we'll reach something similar to the game that I played. Jumping straight into the game, for real now that you have the context of the opening knowledge I had, we can see that bishop g5. Alright, so we can see that my opponent played the tricky move. I wasn't going to fall for that, played e3, c6, and right, I had this arrow here. Just wanted to show that the downside to trying to be tricky is that you lose any chance of having this early bishop f5 if white missteps. So had that coming, trying to be tricky. Knight f8, f3, knight g6, rook d1. So this is a pretty typical position. In the last position I showed, bishop e6 was inserted first. Doesn't really matter because bishop e6 is the main move here and probably the most solid and best. You can see that I've highlighted this pawn here because of my rook to d1 move. It's really good to fully prepare protection of your center to facilitate the advance e4, e5 because prior to doing it, because you might not have time to do so if you initiate too quickly, and after several trades in the center, maybe you can't defend it. That's why you might also see in similar positions king h1 as a prophylactic measure against the opening of this file. By file I mean diagonal. Mincing my words here, but you get the idea. Rook d1. Already here my opponent made a slight inaccuracy. I think bishop e6 was most common and best, but he played knight to d7, and I guess his idea is basically that he feels the pressure, wants to trade a pair of pieces, get some heavy pieces on the open file here to combat e4. But the problem is just that it doesn't stop me from playing e4. In fact, it makes it really easy. Here I have my arrows highlighting here. Get rid of that one for now, but I want to make these central pushes, open up my bishop again, and play for, even for f6, bust the guy right open. If I can achieve e5, then this is a huge advantage. It should be noted that in a similar position you can play knight h5. Just to give you an example of what this looks like, bishop e6 might seem solid, but yeah, this is just killer. Black is a couple tempi short from having good counterplay on c5. Just play f4, f5. Pieces are already even not ideally placed. This would be killer. So jumping back into the game. So black correctly took on e4, takes knight f6. So I'm going to stop in this moment because in the game this is where I took my first big think. I'm going to be completely honest here and say that I hadn't looked at this variation in a while. I mean, I knew all these main ideas, but most of my memory was associated with the ideas where black does not take on e4 and I get to play for this central push and just kill. Here, I still knew some basic ideas, but I also had to contend with my weak e3 square. I had to be concerned about potential knight g4 pushes because I want to push e4 to e5 right away. This is the typical idea. If I can get in e5, then this really easy reroute of the knight to d6, just killer, piling more pieces on f7. My bishop can come to c4 on f7, and it's just going to be very, very difficult to defend. The problem with playing e5 right away, you can see, flip the move too quickly here. I played h3. It's my final decision, just clamping down on the square before taking further action. e5 was actually very possible. Knight g4. Both rook f3 and queen d2 are good measures to stop knight e3. In the game, I kind of discarded rook f3 just because there are problems associated with knight h4. But queen d2 is good enough. It was kind of a miscalculation on my part, where I was thinking that my center was going to get busted pretty bad after c5. What I missed in the game was that I would probably have this move bishop takes g6. And in this position, I still think that white has a pretty nice advantage. Good active play. Black is underdeveloped. We can still try to outpost something here in a few moves, although it's not quite clear how we do that because we can't really jump in. Too many arrows. We can't really jump in very easily. That's a long plan. But this would still be very nice to play. Probably a half a pawn to a pawn advantage considered by the computer. But yeah, this wasn't what I was looking for. It's not the ideas that I knew in the position. So I discarded the early e5 push. Played h3, just clamping down in g4. And when I played h3, I did foresee the resulting position in the next 3 or 4 moves, the plan that my opponent went for. The most obvious move here is going to be bishop e6, and then I just had to calculate what happens if I get to push e5. And so in my head here, I'll just play through the moves because it'll be easier than visualizing it all. I looked at this position and thought, well, can I take knight c3? This looks pretty good. I don't think white has to worry about rook d8 because I can just take on d5. Show you what that looks like. And they'd have to take back with the pawn. Taking back with the rook. Game over. You have to give up an exchange. That'll be really easy to convert. And I thought if they take back with the pawn, well, here, let's get rid of these arrows for the moment. Having this weak pawn on d5, where I have a better minor piece and open lines, thought this should definitely be in my favor. Now, these were my thoughts, and the reason why I had those arrows pre-made there was because this is actually the line that my opponent went for, which caught me off guard. I thought for sure bishop e6 would be the move here. Then knight e4 seemed killer. Just bring the knight into d6, pressure on f7. I can play bishop c4 and trade off his lone defender. I mean, if his knight has to come back to h8 just to defend f7, it's going to be a pretty easy game. I can just pile up more on f7, make some weaknesses, make a second weakness, win some breakthrough. Defense is just too hard in these positions, so this is already the kind of game I was looking for against my lower rated opponent. But yeah, he did catch me off guard for this variation, and all my chess instincts here telling me that I have a serious advantage. Weak pawn, better minor piece, all the things I said already. However, I was finding it very hard to make a tangible claim to that advantage because of a couple of reasons. One, this is where the arrows come in. Black has an idea of rerouting to a good blockading square, pressure on d4, and really this d4 pawn became a problem in a lot of my variations that I was calculating. Queen h4, also quite typical in my variations, giving me problems on the d4 square. This explains my next move, queen b3. I thought this was a kind of a nice way to, for the moment, prevent both knight f8 and queen h4. The reason why we're preventing knight f8, or well, more simply, the reason why we're preventing queen h4 is because you're leaving the defense of this pawn trade the knight so that our rook defends the pawn. Take this pawn. I don't think black is really in time for counterplay against our b pawn. This would be impossible. Knight f8 also stopped because our queen is no longer on c2. Now bishop b5 is pretty devastating. Before with our queen on c2, you can see that he'd have this in-between move of rook c8, and then the other rook can come over to d8. But now that tempo is not available, knight d7 also not possible. Just hang the pawn. So I really liked queen to b3. I thought it was a nice prophylactic measure. My opponent just played what I thought was actually a bit of a surprising move, just playing b6, and yeah, this was annoying. I hadn't expected this kind of easy defensive move that kept the threats of queen h4 alive. Now, I really overestimated his counterplay possibilities. There are a bunch of good moves here. White still has a pretty easy advantage. Well, I'm not going to say easy. It's not so clear, but the first consideration that you have on a move like queen h4 is why not just g3? And this is a move I considered strongly during the game, just to close that out. And then from that position, I could make a lot of improvement moves, double on either the open files, or reroute my bishop to f3 or something to pressure the pawn. But I was just really worried about the weakness of my king. And this is a valid concern. I mean, the computer gives some concrete variations that show that this counterplay is really hard to come by. Maybe a move like queen g5, just king h2, and black kind of runs out of moves. I can, highlighting all the weak pawns here. This one's not super weak, but could become weak. The rooks I'm showing, the square's highlighted because the rooks can choose either file to double up on. This would be a very acceptable position, but I was seeing ghosts. I was afraid that if black ever got any counterplay later in the game, maybe he just had perpetual check or something. I definitely didn't want to draw, so I kind of mentally closed myself into a box here and had to go for something else. Now, I did come up with a different plan here where I wanted to reroute my bishop to f3 to pressure d5, kind of tie his queen down to the defense of the pawn. That way I would never have to worry about h4, and then I could take my time to double my rooks on one of the files. But it wasn't, concretely accurate. Here I started with the move bishop to b5. Not necessary. My idea was simply that I wanted to just push his rook back to the f8 square so that his knight couldn't reroute. And then on the next move I was going to come to e2 and f3. It's just that I had spent so much time thinking about the queen h4 possibility that I'd forgotten that the most obvious way for him to free up his position is this f6 break. Bishop e5 doesn't really, if anything, it helps his cause, getting his rook to support the pawn. So definitely I would call this move a step in the wrong direction. And yeah, bishop b2, completely overlooking. I played this kind of fast because this was my idea in the first place, bishop b5, then bishop e2. But maybe if I'd taken more time in the position, I would have realized that, f6 is so obvious here. I should play a move like, rook to d1 just to waylay that, reassess the position. Here I still have a nice advantage, maybe half a pawn or more by the computer's assessment, but still hard for black to untangle. Yeah, bishop e2, first real, I think, inaccuracy of the game. Just allowing f6. Already black is completely equal. The whole center liquidates. I try to be tricky with how the tension gets resolved, but you can see here, just attacking the knight. Not really much to do. Alright, but already I want to take a slight tangent here to talk about the endgame. While this is pretty equal, in fact exactly equal, 0.00 according to the computer, or 0.01 or whatever, the endgame possibilities are not equal because of the imbalance here of, whoop, mouse was freezing, bishop versus knight. Why do I think that it's not equal? I think it's better for white because look at all these pawns, how they're distributed. equal pawns on both flanks. The bishop, which is a long-range piece that can influence both sides of the board at the same time, is going to be superior to the knight, which has to commit to one side or the other. I'm not saying that it's winning directly if all the heavy pieces come off, but simple, I think, endgame advantage would definitely be playing for 2 results if I could achieve that endgame. So even in this equal position, don't need to agree to a draw or anything like that. I think my opponent definitely misevaluated, or didn't evaluate this endgame at all, or didn't evaluate the way I did, because he was eager to make these trades that I think were unnecessary and it just helped me. So I'm happy to take. I want to facilitate a trade. I think even if black, leaves one rook on the board, one pair of rooks, that shouldn't have any real problems, but I'm just going, so now I force a trade of at least one pair of rooks. But here my opponent made a, I think, I wouldn't call it an inaccuracy per se, because the computer does show that in this position there is possibility for a very precise defense against the intrusion of my king, where very nicely the knight and pawns block the entry squares. My king comes over. Notice that I highlighted in this position that you can't take on h7 yet, just because when your bishop's on that square, g6 would trap you, the king would come over and eat you up. And even if you take the moment to defend, king can't really enter. It's just, seems like it's just barely holding. I could evaluate this deeper, and I'm sure that black has a lot of pitfalls to avoid, but it seems for the moment that black is just able to hold onto this position. So I'm not going to say that the double rook trade on f1 was decisive, but definitely his next move, king g8, is decisive. Already, I'm just going to say I think the king and pawn endgame is winning. If you'd like to take this moment to pause the video and kind of work out some of the ideas for yourself, that would be a good exercise. But in a second here, I'm just going to jump right into it. And I should note that you have to be very careful about jumping into these king and pawn endgames, because I still thought I had quite a strong advantage with the king bishop versus king and knight. And if I wasn't sure that this was winning, I definitely shouldn't trade. If I can't find a way to win, I don't want to throw away potential, endgame grind. But I did seemingly find a win against the pawns. Kings come up. Already in this moment, if you calculate it ahead, you have to see that he has to play g5 here. He can't play the normal king move, because if we're allowed to come and take control of the g5 square, just h5, can't stop our king from entering here. Eventually we have a lot of reserve tempi that he won't have, and we're just going to pick up the g6 pawn and push our pawns to victory. Maybe trade down, sacrifice a pawn. While the king's busy with that, we'll come and take these pawns and push to victory. So already here, it has to be accurate. Whoops, didn't go back far enough. Already here has to be accurate. Play g5, which he did. So he saw this much. King e4, king e6. Now we get to the basically the crux of what I had to calculate before going into the endgame, where I imagine that if our kings are on, let's say, d6 and d4, and if I could get access to the c5 square, like if I could force this pawn to move and gain opposition, I'd win. It'd be Zugzwang, where he couldn't keep me from entering on both squares to either pawn mass. So this was my idea, and I think I can always achieve the opposition, because notice how he has 1 reserve tempi, I have 2 if I short step it here. That's why I played the move b4. Just taking my time. Later, in some order, I can come and challenge the supremacy of the pawn that is guarding the c5 square, or at the very least push my pawns far enough that if I can gain time to attack these pawns, if his king has to come over here and attack my pawns as a counterattack, my pawn queening will be a lot faster because his pawns will not be as far advanced. So that's the idea. I will say that I didn't calculate everything to the complete maximum with if he just tried to prolong this kind of advance as long as possible, but I was pretty confident from the variations I did calculate that I should be winning. Already here though, he blundered, with king f6. I don't really know what he looked at because, the move g3 here is pretty obvious. It's what I played, just stopping the entry of the king. And from here, it's a pretty easy calculation to see that, white's just winning. I'll show, this is the game continuation, so I'll show that in a second. Just to show briefly what happens if he plays, a better move like a6. So here, both the moves g3 and a3 definitely hold. a4 is in fact blows the game, because unfortunately, well, here if I go after the pawns, it's unfortunate, but just to show, we queen at the same time. Can't win that. Jumping back to king d6. What if I play a different move like, say, king d4? He can just kind of wait, and I can't get this square like I wanted, because even if I gain opposition, he has this really nice move, g4, which is actually a resource that I hadn't considered in my calculations, which goes to show that king and pawn games are tricky. There are lots of nuanced moves here, and that I should have been more careful before entering it. But you can see here that even if I were to, gain the tempo here, or gain the opposition, actually that loses the opposition. The problem is going to be that, here, if I'll just get my mouse to work. Nope, it's black to move. Say, probably, I didn't actually analyze this, so I'm going to flick on the computer just to make sure I don't say something completely wrong. Analyzing real time is a dangerous practice. Yeah, just king c6, king d4. Yeah, and the problem is that if white goes to take this pawn now, black can just take this pawn, and either queen at the same time or queen ahead of white. So, oops, yeah, so definitely can't do that. So there is some precision required here that I didn't anticipate. But yeah, just a move like a3, just to show an example line, b5 is exactly what I'd want, where I could gain control of the square, just to show you what that zugzwang looks like. Can't stop me from entering. If he plays a move better than b5, say, oops, jumped too far ahead, just g6. Now it's a bit different. Crucially, the king is not on d6 already, and that one extra tempi matters. And here he doesn't have the same possibilities before with g4. And you'll notice that this is a really nice find by the computer, queening just ahead of him. You can go and check this yourself as well if you check this position. I'm really blowing through a lot of the analysis here, but take my word for it, the nuances do exist, and this is completely winning for white. Jumping back into the game though, I just want to show how this ended. King f6, mistake, covering the square. g4 he played, he's trying to hold on. So maybe he calculated this and thought that this was okay, because if I were to run after the pawn now, we'll see really quickly that, let me just flick off the computer here, even though you couldn't see it, it was being quite annoying on the sidebar there. You'll see that we happened to queen at exactly the same time. However, what he might have missed was king d4. Simple waiting move, and the problem is that I'm just going to wait till his king has to step back to some square before I run to the pawn. Notice that before, when his king was on f5 that we queened at the same time, if he's one move behind, I'm going to queen ahead and win. And so that's exactly what happened. He went right in. Also, just for, just to show that if he'd started with g6, just trying to burn a move, I can just shuffle all day. And he runs out of tempi. So queen one move ahead of him, queen f8, easy find. Just take his last pawn. And no matter where he put his king, my queen was going to sit across the pawn. And at this point, he resigned. So this is my game here. What are the takeaways from the game? Really wanted to highlight back in the initial position my intended setup of getting the central pawn majority to get an advantage. That's a real highlight of the exchange variation and why it's so powerful and challenging for black. The typical setup that black achieved, I wanted to highlight. And also, probably the key moment of the game is when I played bishop e2 in that later position and allowed the f6 break, which you should definitely not allow. You have to find a way to really squeeze. Should have played rook to e1 there and held on. So hope you learned a thing or two, both about the exchange variation and the Queen's Gambit decline in general, and definitely learn from my mistakes. Always be on the lookout for your opponent's counterplay. So thank you, and see you in the next video.